All right, chapter 21. So, only 2 more chapters left, because we, of course, go up to chapter 23, as I'm sure you are aware. And the last 3 chapters deal with pretty much 1950 to today and different aspects of somewhat modern society, what has happened in recent history. And it's good because you usually don't get a whole 3 chapters dedicated to recent history. So if it's something that you're particularly interested in, that's great for you. If it's not, I don't know what to say. But that's the way that the book has laid it out. So that's what we're with. All right, our introduction. Today marks exactly 20 years since the dawn of freedom and democracy in our country, declared South African President Jacob Zuma on April 27, 2014. We gained equal citizenship in the land of our birth. It was the 20th anniversary of the end of apartheid and white domination, as well as the election of the highly regarded Nelson Mandela as the country's first African leader. But not everyone was ready to celebrate. The activist Archbishop Desmond Tutu said, "I am glad that Mandela is dead. I didn't think there would be disillusionment so soon." He was referring to widespread corruption in official circles and frustration with the slow pace of movement toward overcoming the poverty and inequalities of the apartheid era. So what is the purpose of this quote? Well, the end of apartheid and white domination in South Africa was not a cause of celebration for all. In a lot of ways, it's similar to the end of slavery in America. Just because slavery is over doesn't mean there's automatic equality and now everybody is happy and equal and we all get along and we all hold hands, and that's not the case. And it's the same for South Africa and for pretty much all other former European colonies. Just because colonization might be over doesn't mean everything's great and they're, equal players on the world stage and there's no more poverty. No, that's not the case. However, the political landscape did change dramatically with the end of European empires. Europe rebuilt a modern economy and moved towards greater union with other European nations. That has been shaken a bit with Brexit. Great Britain's desire to exit the European Union, but generally speaking, the European Union has marked a move towards a lot of an alliance between these countries that were formerly enemies. Communism is also going to expand into Eastern Europe, China, Southeast Asia, and Cuba. And in some of these areas, rise and then fall within that time frame. The Cold War develops and ends in the time frame we're talking about. China becomes powerful, and the Middle East becomes increasingly unstable. So, as we just said, Europe was able to rebuild their industrial economy and revive their democratic political systems after the horrors of World War II. And this showed that all in all, industrial society was resilient. It was not without issues. It was not without difficulties, but generally speaking, they were able to rebuild their economies. And they were able to integrate their economies with other Western European countries specifically because, of course, as we'll see, as I'm sure you also know, Eastern Europe was, quote-unquote, behind the Iron Curtain, as we like to say. Quoting Winston Churchill there, they were communist nations. But the European Economic Community of 1957 eventually became the European Union in 1994. So here on this map, you can see the original members of the EU. They're in green. New members from 1973 to 1986 would be notable nations such as Denmark, the UK, Ireland, Spain and Portugal, Greece. New members, pretty much all of Eastern Europe, are in that orange color, and candidates for membership as of 2018 include the countries that are in that grayish color. So, as I'm sure, again, you know, from taking a U.S. history class, I'm sure, at some point in time in your past, the U.S. emerged as a global superpower after 1945. and really became the center of Western civilization. And of course, very famously, their counterpart was the Soviet Union in the East. And so it became, as part of the United States' role as leader in this, this part of the world, it became our mission to A, rebuild Western Europe, and B, the overarching goal of preventing these countries originally, and then eventually other countries, as we'll see, from turning to communism. The hope being that if they're able to rebuild economically, they're not going to see a need to do a radical political shift. And so to that end, the Marshall Plan, for example, sent $12 billion in economic aid, advisors, technicians to Europe to help them rebuild. And this is an indication of, again, their intent to lead, but also to fight against communism. And we formed our first standing military alliance in NATO in 1949, ending our, up until that point, tradition, because we hadn't had any standing alliances. We fought in World War I and World War II, but those were not permanent alliances that we entered into. This is our first permanent military alliance with Europe in 1949. The purpose at the time being to defend Europe against the Soviet Union. Another big change is Japan. Japan is going to become an economic giant from the 1950s to the 1970s. They were dependent on the U.S. for military security, but essentially after dropping the atomic bombs on Japan, it became part of the United States' policy to help them rebuild as well. And again, there's the overarching goal of we don't want them to turn to communism either. The Soviet Union are also going to use convict labor force for cheap labor and cheap essentials. China, in the meantime, we talked about their turn to communism, began building socialism very different than the Soviets. They do have an ally in the Soviet Union. Also, revolutionaries already governed large parts of the country and had been for decades. They had large support in rural areas and peasants. They have a large population, but a small industrial base. And so the hope, of course, is that that will change, as well as the limited agricultural land that they have in comparison to the Soviet Union, and the fact that they have less developed literacy and modern education, including a transportation network. All of these are going to be hurdles that they're going to have to overcome. So, to that end, building a modern society in communist China. China followed a socialist modernization at first. In the 1950s, agricultural collectivization was peaceful due to Chinese Communist Party relationship with the peasantry. They already had a lot of support among farmers, and so collectivization wasn't as turbulent as one might expect. Modeling on the Soviet Union, they built up heavy industry, urban factories, they centralized planning of urban areas, and also mobilized women for the workforce. And from 1958 to 1960, they launched the Great Leap Forward, or an effort to mobilize for the development and move to a fully communist society. And this was Mao Zedong's response to individualism, careerism, and urban bias, and the hope that, again, this would help China become fully communist. Now, Mao's effort to combat any capitalist tendencies remaining was the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. This helped bring healthcare and education to the countryside, also led to rural industrialization and an establishment of local government control. Part of this consolidation of power at the state level, Mao called for a rebellion against the Communist Party itself. He convinced that capitalist values had infiltrated the Communist Party in a very similar way that we have the Red Scare in the United States, in which there was a belief led by Senator Joseph McCarthy that there had been infiltration of communists within our own government. Similar here, except that there was basically an elimination of anyone suspected of being an enemy. So millions of young Red Guards responded. They attacked officials, teachers, etc., kind of the scholarly class, if you will. And violence broke out, and so civil war was threatened until the military was called in to put down the rebellion, or potential rebellion, I should say. All right, the Cold War. The Cold War is going to be a global war. Why is it called a Cold War, in case you didn't know? It's not called a hot war because a hot war is where there's direct fighting between two opposing sides, and that was not the case in the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. There was never any direct fighting. Indirect fighting in some instances, but not direct fighting, hence it's a Cold War. And Europe was the Cold War's first arena, though not its only one. Think about such conflicts as the war in Vietnam. That, taking place in Southeast Asia, is part of the Cold War. The Soviets began to be concerned for the security and control they had over Eastern European countries. On the other side, the Americans and the British desired for open societies linked to the capitalist world economy. And so you have two divergent views of what should happen in Eastern Europe. And so in response to this, the Soviet Union created a rival military alliance to NATO, and that was the Warsaw Pact, which is basically NATO, but in the Soviet countries. It's, of course, no longer around since the Soviet Union has fallen. And the big difference there is that the American sphere of influence, i.e. Western Europe, was largely voluntary. You can join NATO or not join NATO. It's in your benefit to join NATO, but you don't have to. Whereas in the Soviet sphere in Eastern Europe, it was imposed. You will join the Warsaw Pact. You don't get a choice. And again, the so-called Iron Curtain divided these two spheres. In some cases, it's a literal wall, as in the Berlin Wall, which of course separated the city of Berlin into East and West. West being capitalist and democratic, and the East being communist. But in other cases, there's not an actual wall. There's a figurative wall between Eastern Europe and Western Europe, Soviet and democratic. And so here we can see the global Cold War. So NATO countries are there in the orange color, and the Warsaw Pact countries are those in green. And they actually used colors on this map that makes sense for a change, because the lighter green are other communist countries, not necessarily part of the Warsaw Pact, but by nature of them being communist countries have the natural ally in the Soviet Union. So, communism eventually spread to Asia, which of course was of great concern to the United States as well as other Western European countries. China, as we just mentioned, Korea, and Vietnam all caused conflict. North Korea invaded South Korea in 1950, which issued a response from the United Nations, mainly from the United States, supplying most of the soldiers to fight in the Korean War, though not all of them. And of course, Vietnam, the communist takeover in Vietnam led to a massive U.S. intervention in the 1960s. There was a slow buildup, but eventually, of course, direct boots on the ground combat are going to start throughout the 1960s, mainly under the control of LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson. All right. There was also a major Cold War era conflict in Afghanistan, in the Middle East. A Marxist party took power in 1978, but soon alienated much of the population. This also was connected to a Soviet military intervention from 1979 to 1989, which also met with very little success. And the Soviet Union withdrew in 1989 under international pressure, causing any kind of communist rule in Afghanistan to collapse. Cuba, of course, very famously turned to communism, I should say, sorry about that. Fidel Castro came to power in the early 1960s. And our hostility towards this communist outpost led the then leader of the Soviet Union, Khrushchev, to send nuclear missiles to Cuba, pointing right at the United States with the capability of hitting the United States very quickly. And this led to the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962, in which the United States demanded the removal of the missiles. Cuba and the Soviet Union refused. There was a standoff, and for a period of time there was fear, and legitimate fear at that there would be nuclear war, that this was it. But eventually, both sides backed down, and there was an agreement that the United States would not invade Cuba. And here we see Castro in the 1950s, late 1950s, prior to seizing full control of Cuba. All right, so the United States is the first to develop nuclear weapons during World War II. Very quickly thereafter, the Soviet Union succeeded in acquiring their own nuclear weapons in 1949, which led to a massive arms race. So an arms race means arms, in this case weapons, and so that means that each side is going to try to outdo one another. Once they hear about one side having such and such a weapon, now they need that weapon and they need to make it bigger and better, and then the other side hears about it, and so on and so forth. And it leads to increased tensions and can lead to war. And by 1989, the world had nearly 60,000 nuclear warheads with very complex delivery systems, which is terrifying for people because we know that nuclear war didn't happen, but that wasn't a given that nuclear war wouldn't happen. There were many instances in which it seemed like it could have, and that's a terrifying thing to have to live with. And from 1949 to 1989, fear of a massive nuclear destruction and even the possible extinction of humankind was a reality. Again, I think we tend to look back on the Cold War, and here in the United States, we look back at like the Red Scares, and we're like, this is ridiculous. Why were people so scared? Well, because now we know that nuclear war didn't happen, but at the time, there was no telling that it couldn't happen. And both sides knew how serious their destructive power was. Again, literally the ability to kill off humankind. And so there was a careful avoidance of any kind of nuclear provocation, especially after 1962 and the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the avoidance of any direct military confrontation, though both sides continued to build up arsenals, which of course continues to build up tension. Here, of course, the famous mushroom cloud of testing a nuclear weapon, and this again, it was a legitimate fear during the Cold War. People living through this time, children having to do drills for a possible nuclear attack where they'd have to duck and cover under their desks. That, of course, would do absolutely nothing in the case of a nuclear attack, but you can't really tell children that if we're going to be attacked, there's nothing you can do, because that's not something you tell children. But yeah, that would do nothing. So both the United States and the Soviet Union courted third world countries for their own spheres of influence and to stop the other from getting allies in said nations. So the United States intervened in nations such as Iran, the Philippines, Guatemala, El Salvador, Chile, the Congo, and elsewhere, because, again, they feared communist penetration in these regions. And to that end, the United States often supported corrupt authoritarian regimes which were not akin to our values simply because they were not communist. Like, well, they're corrupt people, they're not good leaders, but they're not communist leaders, so we're going to support them. And many third world countries resisted being used as pawns by these two remaining superpowers. Some countries, such as India, claimed non-alignment status during the Cold War, neither side, and some countries tried to play the superpowers against each other for their own benefit. Again, the United States became the leader of the West against communism after World War II. We were sustained by a very strong economy in the 1950s and an increasing middle class. And again, this is mainly because no physical destruction occurred as a result of World War II on our own soil. I mean, aside from the attack of Pearl Harbor, none of the war took place anywhere near us. We didn't have to deal with the rebuild that the European countries did. And because of this, we also had the most productive economy. Eventually, communist states are going to enter an era of turmoil. Stalin's many, many crimes against humanity came to light in the mid-1950s, and this led to reform movements in Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Poland against Soviet-dominated communist governments. And there was an increasing conflict among these communist countries as well. Yugoslavia rejected Soviet domination. Soviet invasions of Hungary and Czechoslovakia were required to crush reform movements in the 1950s and 60s. In the early 1980s, Poland was also threatened with invasion from the Soviet Union, and this brutal suppression of reform really tarnished the image of Soviet communism, and it gave credence to Western views of the Cold War as a struggle between tyranny and freedom, because obviously, if you have to respond to any attempts at reform with a show of force, that certainly doesn't look like freedom. That is the opposite of freedom. And so more and more people will begin to fall in line with the Western view of the Cold War. Also, there's going to be a growing division between the Soviet Union and China, stemming from the use of nuclear arms. China went to war against a communist Vietnam in 1979. Yes, against communist Vietnam. Doesn't seem to make much sense, but this is something that the Soviet Union did not, that drew a further wedge between them. Vietnam, in turn, invaded a communist Cambodia in the late 1970s. And by the late 1970s, world communism had reached its greatest extent, and it is going to start a decline after. At this time, there's also going to be a struggle for decolonization, focused on colonial rule, subordination, poverty, and racism. There's going to be the declining legitimacy of empire and race as a credible base for political or social life. And World War II really shook up this notion. In the same way that we talked about World War I is shaking up a lot of people's common values and outlook on the world. Are we right in the way that we look at the world around us if we can, enter such a devastating war? And here we're seeing some similar things, like what's the legitimacy of this age of empires as the best way of running the world? And by the late 1940s, the Philippines, India, Pakistan, Burma, Indonesia, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, and Israel all achieved independence. So a lot. Also, by the mid-1950s to the mid-1970s, over 50 African colonies achieved their independence. And in the 1970s, you're going to see this in Pacific Islands. You're going to see it in the Caribbean, places like the Bahamas, Barbados, Jamaica in the 1960s and 70s. Cuba, though it became independent in 1902, started rejecting American unofficial control in 1959. So, as those long lists of countries will show you, we are here at the end of empire in world history. And the end of empire becomes associated with nationalistic ideology for the first time, as these various colonial former colonies are going to claim their own nationalist ideology as a rallying cry for their independence. They claimed international status, and many empires fell in the 20th century. After World War I, and then really after World War II, the Austrian and Ottoman empires after World War I, the Russian Empire, of course, and German and Japanese empires with World War II. So the idea of national self-determination started to grow, and it grew, and it led to global acceptance in the 20th century. And this is not just limited to empires that had outright colonies. Also, empires without territory came under attack. For example, the United States' involvement in Latin America, the Mexican Revolution, and the last territorial empires fell at the end of the 20th century. The Soviet Union officially in 1991, though China remained intact. So here, focusing on Southeast Asia and Africa, you can see the different years of independence listed under each country. And the countries are also color-coded as to what nation they had been a colony of. All right, so democratic European state values and national self-determination went against colonial rule realities. So why now? Why is this all coming to a head now. Again, there was opposition to colonization from the beginning. Why right now? Well, Europe was severely weakened by world wars. It's pretty obvious. Also, Europe was no longer seen as morally superior as a result of 2 world wars. The outbreak of these wars is directly linked to Europe, though again, we have the Pacific Theater, part of or not part of, whatever you want to make the argument there, World War II. So, again, if they can lead the world into these destructive wars, how are they morally superior to anyone else? Well, they're not. Also, you have new superpowers on the scene, the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Those are against older European colonial empires, such as the British Empire. And European colonies were vulnerable without local elites or educated Westerners. Also, second and third generation educated elites started to insist on immediate independence because they didn't feel that colonial rule was necessary for progress. If you remember that a lot of the justification for gaining colonies from the European side of things was that they were going to bring progress to these regions, and that really didn't happen. So, hey, progress isn't coming from the Europeans anyway. We don't need them. We don't need a gradual independence. We need independence now. And common people were increasingly receptive to this idea. Colonial rulers at this time were on the defensive. Planning for decolonization included political reform, investments in things like railroads, ports, telegraph lines, elections, constitution writing, and it took a lot of pressure from nationalist movements as well. So who's leading these nationalist movements? Mostly male leaders who were educated. They helped to organize political parties, recruit others, plan strategy, develop ideas, and negotiating within the colonial state. Some became, quote-unquote, fathers of the country. Some directed the military. They administered to liberated areas. And they sought to join a modern world of other independent nation states, the UN, and modern technology. And the leaders had to recruit followers. For example, Gandhi had millions of nonviolent followers. Rarely cohesive groups of oppressed people. There's a lot of tensions with one another. So within India, there were tensions between leaders for independence. Gandhi's approach was the approach of nonviolence. He held everyone equal and tried to improve the position of women and untouchables, which is a case of the Indian subcontinent. And some thought these efforts distracted from independence, that the main focus should be on independence. This resulted in the Hindu-Muslim divide. In 1947, India became Pakistan, which was mostly Muslim in the north, and India, mostly Hindu in the south. Here is Gandhi. Of course, his approach was heavily studied by Martin Luther King, and he adopted many of Gandhi's nonviolent approaches within the civil rights movement in the United States, which was also not a cohesive movement. There was a lot of variability within the civil rights movement in the United States as to the best approach, violent, nonviolent, etc. And again, nationalist movements vary from one another. We can't say that, Gandhi's nonviolent approach was the approach of all these nations gaining independence. Remember the long list of countries and the map that showed all the different countries gaining their independence, and every single country has a different story. Sometimes independence took years, sometimes decades. Sometimes there was a distant colonial power. Sometimes there's a present white settler minority that is going to continue to live there. Sometimes the independence was gained through peaceful political pressure or armed struggle. It really just depends. And there are also different ideologies for seeking independence. It might be religious, such as in India or the Islamic world, or secular, such as in Marxist or communist nations. So, after freedom, there were some common conditions for creating a new political order, and things, of course, were not easy for these newly freed countries. Again, just because you gain independence doesn't mean now everything's great and grand and wonderful. Many new nations had to deal with a growing population, diverse cultures, because remember, sometimes when they made colonies, they did not take into account, years and years, sometimes thousands of years of history between differing ethnic groups. And this is especially true in places like in the continent of Africa. And also growing public employment as the state assumed more responsibility for economic development. So the Europeans had established many democratic institutions in the colonies before colonial rule ended. And this worked best in India as it transitioned into an independent nation. But elsewhere, in a country that maybe had a more fragile establishment of democracy, this led to a lot of corrupt personal tyrannies, or quote-unquote big man dictatorships taking over, because dictatorships, remember we talked about this, we talked about World War II, they come to power when there's an issue of a power vacuum. So as colonial rule ebbs away and there's no one in power and things are chaotic, that's the perfect opportunity for a dictator to come in and to seize power. So for example, there were dozens of military takeovers in Africa by the early 1980s due to these conflicts, and multiple military interventions in Latin America in the 60s and the 70s. However, there is going to be the globalization of democracy in the late 20th century. This is due to popular movements leading to multi-party elections and new constitutions being written in many countries such as Spain, Portugal, and Greece. And eventually, democracy became viewed as a universal principle, as a kind of political system that could work anywhere. This is because authoritarian governments had failed to fix economic situations, and this led to a growth of civil society. And some leaders and governments turned authoritarian or corrupt in office. All right, the end of communism is a long, slow decline, lasting roughly from the 1950s to 2000. It's going to lead to the end of the Cold War. Why? Because without one of the superpowers, there's no need for a Cold War anymore. It lessened the threat of nuclear war. It led to the birth of 20 new nation states. And there were, again, several steps to the end of the communist era. China in the late 1970s abandoned Maoist communism. Eastern Europe in 1989 saw growth in popular movements to overthrow communist governments. And in 1991, the Soviet Union fell, and communist control of Russia collapsed. Why did communism fail? Well, it couldn't compete economically with capitalism, and that was pretty obvious to people living within communist nations. And it also proved to be morally inferior to democracy and human rights. There's no competing political party, so there's no one to criticize. There's no oversight, such as we have when you have a country with freedom of speech and freedom of the press that can provide that oversight, and you have competing political parties to check one another. And within the communist state, you don't have that. So beyond Mao in China, there's going to be a series of reforms which are going to really change communism significantly within China. So Deng Xiaoping led China after Mao. He dismantled collectivized farming and led to an era of slow industrial reform, which gave greater authority to state managers, special enterprise zones with foreign investment, and township and village enterprise. So the outcome of these reforms, there's huge economic growth in China and better prosperity for many. And the results of that would be better diets, lower mortality, declining poverty, urban construction, and higher exports. Downside, lots of corruption, lots of regional inequalities, urban overcrowding leading to city pollution, periodic inflation, and a lot of urban vices. And still, they were not willing to promote democracy or relinquish any kind of political monopoly. Again, it's just the Communist Party in communist countries. That's pretty much the way it works. So again, there's no real oversight. All right, so Gorbachev led the Soviet Union since the mid-1980s. He launched a program called Perestroika in 1987, which led to state enterprise free from government regulation. Cooperatives were permitted, private farming was allowed, as well as joint enterprises with foreigners. You can see a lot of the loosening of traditional communist practices, which things like collectivized farming, government control of industry, etc. There were also cultural and political policies. Glasnost and allowed new cultural and intellectual freedoms. Again, typically in communist countries, you don't have freedom of the press. And so you're going to see some changes there. Democratization and also a new parliament. And he also moved to end the Cold War with military cuts, arms controls, negotiation with the United States, and not intervening as other Eastern European communist governments were overthrown, as they had in the past with military interventions. Eventually, the Soviet Union began weakening, and it collapsed. Things like inflation, little availability of any kind of goods, any kind of needed goods, rationing, unemployment, little private farming, little foreign investment. There was a growing democratic movement, as well as a growing labor union movement, and also nationalist movements, especially in Eastern European countries. So this inspired the Miracle Year of 1989. And throughout 1989 in Eastern Europe, there were massive demonstrations. A lot of attempts at last-minute reform to try to stop nations from leaving their communist governments behind. There's a breach of the Berlin Wall. Again, that physical and also symbolic divide between East and West in the city of Berlin. And also the growth of new political groups. And so many unpopulist communist regimes were overthrown, and this success inspired nationalists and Democrats within the Soviet Union that the time was ripe to finally overthrow Soviet control within the Soviet Union itself. And here you see them breaching the Berlin Wall. It's definitely not a good sign for the health of your nation if you have to build up a wall to stop people from leaving your country, and you have to put guards on there to shoot people trying to leave. That's not a really good sign that you have a thriving political and economic system. So there was a military coup in August of 1991 that triggered the end of the Soviet Union and the communist regime. And Gorbachev's inability to address problems may be more of a reason for the collapse than the problems with themselves. So communism had shrunk by much by the 21st century, and it was effectively dead. Great powers continued rivalries. By 2016, there was a hostile relationship between Russia and the United States. This is a response to the eastward expansion of NATO. You also have the very recent and controversial Russian intervention with Ukraine and the Crimea. There are rivals within the Syrian civil war. There's Russian meddling within the U.S. elections very recently. So there are continuing tensions between the United States and Russia. Also, China's growing military and economic power is creating tension with the United States and Japan as well. There's also instability and conflict within the Middle East, which continues to this day. There's conflicts between the new 1948 created state of Israel and Palestine, or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which, I mean, they have whole classes on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So if you really want, this is something that really interests you, and it interests definitely a lot of people. Again, wherever you're going to to go off and continue your college education, definitely look. It's a popular class, probably not going to be a struggle to find it, but you can look for it. And again, there are whole classes on this because it is a very deep conflict. Also, the Iranian Revolution of 1979 created an Islamist government there. It triggered a war with Iraq in the 1980s and became a threat to Israel, creating rivalry also with Saudi Arabia. So here we see a map of the Middle East at this time. Much land in Israeli-occupied territory is disputed, and again, that's part of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Also, terrorist attacks by radical Islamist groups have proliferated since the Cold War, as we, of course, know intimately here in the United States. They are often random and unpredictable, and they also target civilians, not government headquarters, as one might expect. And the purpose of this is to generate fear and insecurity, as that's what the purpose of terrorist groups are. The most significant being the September 11th attack against the World Trade Center in the United States. But European, Russian, and Islamic cities are also targets for these terrorist groups. So another result of growing conflict there are many refugees from the Middle East, from Africa, and many head to Europe as a source of stability and a place to start a new life. The Syrian civil war very recently generated 12 plus million refugees, so more than 12 million refugees fleeing Syria. And within the Syrian civil war, the United States, Russia, and various Muslim governments took sides, and there was also quite a bit of regional rivalry as well. And of course, the refugee crisis was and continues to be news and something that concerns much of the world today. There are continued conflicts between India and Pakistan, between North Korea and its neighbors, between China and Taiwan. Almost all had nuclear weapons. Have the global north versus the global south, and civil wars and separatist movements have taken shape, and global military spending rose in the early 21st century. So again, we like to think that as we progress forward in time, things are getting better, like we're moving towards some better world. And in some ways we are, but as we can see here, in some ways we are not, and we still have ways to go. And I don't say that as a means of being like really pessimistic and that you should have a pessimistic outlook on the world. But it's important to remember, because if we just assume that things are automatically going to get better, we stop working to make things better and we stop being vigilant, and we can't do that. And as students of history, that is something that you should definitely be aware of. So, reflections. Should historians or history students make moral judgments about those they study? Oh, this is a big one. Some say we have to be objective, but we also have to acknowledge our opinions. I mean, you can be objective, but you also are going to have a personal opinion, and you have to acknowledge that opinion in the ways in which it might influence the way you're looking at a person or an event. And acknowledging our opinions also shows our way of caring about the past and our way of relating to our ancestors. Because, of course, I'm sure, when you talk about an event in a class that affected your family, in some ways it hits different than an event that was, removed from. Not that you can't be interested in it, but when you know, like, oh, yes, I'm learning about this in my family, they were there. And they were affected by this. It hits differently. So like when I think about World War II, and I think about the long drawn out battle that occurred, especially in northern Italy, as the Americans fought their way up the peninsula of Italy, and the Nazis were struggling to gain control. And I know that my grandmother's family was still there, and they were involved in the resistance, and they had a member that was murdered by the Nazis. Like that, just when I read about it or I learn more about it, it just kind of hits closer to home, because you think, oh, they were there. My ancestors were there. And I'm sure it's the same for many of you. So it's hard to say, oh, I don't have a personal opinion about that and to be completely objective. So again, you're human. You try to be objective about things, but you have to acknowledge, yeah, I'm human and I have a personal opinion about it, and try to keep that in mind as you study it. So, making judgments also informs all historical analysis. For instance, communism brought a lot of hope to many, but it was responsible for many crimes, and it failed in many instances. And the study of communism challenges our inclination to judge. Affirming our values while acknowledging ambiguities achieves intellectual maturity. And that is one way that history is helpful. And history is helpful in a lot of ways. Again, as I mentioned before, a couple slides, it helps us to be vigilant. We know we're not automatically going to move to some sort of better society. And so we have to be vigilant for things that we know can happen. And when you study history, you know things like wars can happen, things like genocides can happen, famines can happen, all these things can happen, and we have to be on the lookout for them, and history helps us to do that. So, read these sources, 20.1 through 6, and answer the question. Based on these sources, how would you describe the kind of society that the Chinese Communist Party sought to create in China during Mao's lifetime? So you're going to have this chapter question and the chapter question for next week, and then that's going to be it for the discussion boards. We're going to call it a day on those. So just 2 more. Hang in there. You're almost done. The end is near for these lectures and the discussions and the quizzes and all of it. Hang in there.